After I originally posted my electric truck mount video, I've had a lot of questions about the system and the way it was put together, and I've also had some requests to do a step-by-step on how to build an electric truck mount. So that's what we're going to be doing today. I'm basically going to build the simplest electric truck mount that I know of. It'll consist of a 55-gallon drum and 2 vacuum motors. Now, just a little bit of history. When I first started carpet cleaning for myself, which was around 2005, I cleaned part-time. And I built this exact system. You know, I'm not an engineer. I didn't come up with a super awesome design. It's just a simple way to build an electric truck mount and have it be very efficient, be very cost effective, and when something goes wrong, you don't have to spend hundreds or thousands of dollars repairing it. This is the basics of the system right here, the drum and the vacuum motors. Obviously there are a few more parts that need to go on it, like the drain valve. We'll need a baffle on the inside to baffle the vacuum from the incoming water, and a few other parts. For the vacuum motors, I'm going to be using the Lamb 116765-13 motors. Now, the reason that I'm using these particular vacuums is because this is what I've always used. And I know there's a lot of talk about the 6.6 motors and how they're more powerful and all this, but let me just tell you my opinion on it. I don't discount the numbers, such as the CFM and the lift on vacuum motors. It definitely, you know, that's a thing that needs to be considered. But what I can tell you is I put much less emphasis on the numbers and a lot more on performance. There's a lot of different variables that go into any system. So those numbers are not always going to be exactly what they are. These 116765-13 motors have proven since, like I said, about 2005 to be solid performers. They create a tremendous amount of vacuum. They're very long lasting. But I've ran these motors, I'm quite sure, way past their normal life expectancy, and they just continue to perform. After having done thousands of jobs, and I know that these motors work good, I've considered the 6.6s, but I think I'm probably going to stick with these. I'm going to be using just a standard 55-gallon open head steel drum. And of course you can see the ring right here where you can unbolt this and remove the ring to remove the lid. And it'll need to have the 2-inch bung fitting right here where you can put your vacuum port. Now, I've been through several of these drums over the years. I estimate probably a year and a half to 2 years out of one of these before the rust gets so bad that it really needs to be replaced. And I've tried both 30-gallon and 55-gallon. Now, don't ask me why I went with a 30-gallon originally. It was nice for it to be portable. You could actually put the whole thing on a dolly and wheel it where you want it to go. The real problem with the 30-gallon tank is it's a total of 30 gallons. But you're probably only going to be able to get about 20 gallons of usable space. But that's really not enough to be able to do more than, you know, a couple small bedrooms before you have to dump. And so the 55-gallon is a much better option. I did look into getting a stainless steel 55-gallon drum, but the prices of the stainless drums were so high that I was better off just buying a traditional waste tank. But as I said, I used a drum and vacuum motor setup for about 9 years, and it works fine, and it's a very economical way to get into carpet cleaning. So with that said, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to get the ring off of this drum, remove the lid, and I'm going to go ahead and start putting the waste tank together. When I was using the drums for waste tanks, I never reinstalled this ring. I left it off because the lid has a rubber seal going all the way around it. And when you turn your vacuum motors on, it sucks that lid down and it's airtight. So there was no real worry that any air was going to leak out. Plus, I like to be able to rinse the waste tank out a few times a week, and to be able to clean the filters that I put on the inlet pipes. I needed to be able to access it a little bit easier, and it was really just too much trouble to reinstall the ring and take it off each time when I don't think that it's needed. See, this is the rubber seal that I'm talking about, and really even after a couple years of use, I really never found any degradation in this seal. It's still sealed up very, very tight, and the rubber didn't rot away or get eaten away or anything like that. Okay, the very first things that I'm going to do is I'm going to cut the holes for the vacuum motors in the lid, and I'm going to cut the hole for the dump valve on the bottom of the drum. Since our vacuum motors are 5.7 inches, I'm going to get them pretty evenly spaced and positioned where I want. And to be honest, it doesn't have to be exact, but in addition to the vacuum motors on the lid, right here and on the other side, I'm going to have a couple eyelet tie downs, so I'll just need to be sure and leave room for those. So I'm going to measure this out and mark the holes where I want to go ahead and cut. To figure out the exact placement for the vacuum motors, which again does not really have to be exact, you just want to be able to have enough space for everything to fit. I could either space these out and measure it and just kind of use the vac motor as a template, or I can use one of the gaskets. So when you order your vac motors, don't forget to order a couple gaskets of the correct size. And of course these are 5.7 motors, so I have 5.7 gaskets. So I'm going to take this center section out because it's already pre-cut for you depending on how you need to use it, and I'll lay these down to figure out where I need to place everything. It's just easier for me to use the gaskets than the motors. All I did here was mark off the center to help me kind of align everything up. Alright, now I'm going to set my vac motors on just to make sure we got plenty of room and they're not going to be any conflicting areas, which they're not. I just want to make sure that these tabs were far enough apart that there wouldn't be any issues. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to drill my 2 holes right here. By the way, this is a 2-inch hole saw, and I can use this hole saw for both these vacuum motor holes and for the hole for the dump valve. Okay, the DeWalt's struggling a little bit, so I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to get a corded drill and make a little bit shorter work of this. Got the trusty Craftsman. I placed the motors back on the lid because next I want to mark the holes for these eye bolts. And now this is not a step that you have to do, but I operate out of a trailer and I need to be able to strap this down. Same thing if you had a van and you need to strap this down. You have to figure out a way to keep it from moving. After all, at say even 40 gallons in here at roughly 8 pounds per gallon, that's a lot of weight. So the way I secured it was I put an eye bolt on each side, and then I just ratchet strapped it down to some more eye bolts that were in the floor, and I never had an issue. But if you're going to find some other way to strap this in or mount it, then you could probably skip this step. If not, this is how I did it. So the motors are placed up here just to make sure there's no clearance issues. Again, I'm not going to make this be an exact science. I just want to be sure that there won't be any clearance problems. Now, in addition to these eye bolts, all the hardware I'm using, like the bolts to mount down the vacuum motors, are all going to be 1/4 inch. So I kept everything the same because I bought some nuts and washers and lock washers, so I wanted to be able to just buy one pack to keep things simple. Now you can see there's a few little burrs and stuff right here on the inside from where we drilled it. It's not really that big of a deal, but I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to get those off. So I got these pretty well cleaned up. For a drain valve, I'm going to be using the standard Volterra gate valve like this. And if you've looked at any carpet cleaning equipment or you're a carpet cleaner, you're very familiar with these, as they're on pretty much every waste tank, whether it's Truckmount or portable. They have these valves. Now this is an 1.5 inch ID. Now I didn't buy the 1.5 inch for any particular reason other than I think this was about $12–13 on Amazon. It was easy to get. Now the only real issue using these is finding some type of nut with a flange that will butt up against the flange that's built in, because we'll drill a hole in our drum and the drum will be right here, and then you'll need some type of nut to go behind it. Most truck mount carpet cleaning tanks and portables already have the threads built in, so you can just screw this in. Now this nut with a built-in flange is something that I had in one of my parts bins. Unfortunately, I don't have any idea where it came from, so it wouldn't do me any good to recommend one of these, because I searched online and I didn't find any. Maybe you'll have better luck, but something like this works out perfect. Now you may be able to find something like this at either Interlink, John Don, or a supply place like that. I did not look there. I just looked online in general and didn't see any. What I did find, and I was able to get locally at Tractor Supply, and I'm sure other places like Rural King and those type of stores have these, is an 1.5" bulkhead fitting. Now I do not need the nut right here. But what I need is this piece. Now this is the 1.5" diameter, because this thing is huge, but it's the 1.5" inside diameter right here. And what we can do is, when we stick our valve through the drum, this right here will screw on from the inside, and it has a really big flange right here to butt up against the drum to make a tight seal. Our Valterra valve is an 1.5" inside diameter, so outer diameter is a little bit bigger. We're still going to use our 2-inch hole saw, and you can see it has very little place, so it's going to be perfect to cut the hole for the dump valve. If you decide to go with the big bulkhead fitting like this, just remember to leave enough room that this doesn't hit the bottom of your drum, because you want to get your valve as low as possible to drain as much water out as possible. But you got to be sure that you got enough clearance for this. So I'm probably going to sit this right on the bottom of the drum and then raise it up just a little bit, and then mark my holes right there to drill for this. I measured the total height of this drum, and it's about 34 3/16. So I want to measure right here, and it's about 1/2 inch. So I need to deduct 1/2 inch away from 34 3/16, and then move it up just a little bit to be able to find the proper place to put my dump valve. But if you're doing this, don't go off of my measurements, because there's lots of manufacturers of drums and yours could be completely different. So you need to measure it for yourself. So with those measurements, I know that I need to be at about 33.5 inches for the bottom of the flange that's going to go in the back of the dump valve. So the flange is about 4 inches. So of course 2 inches would be the middle. So I'll take 2 inches away from 33.5, and we're about 31.5 inches down. Alright, so that puts the flange on the inside, of course, about right here. Now it will leave a little bit of water in the waste tank, but look, if you're going to mount it with the ratchet straps, you can always loosen the ratchet straps and actually tip the tank forward to get that last little bit of water out if it's an issue for you. Okay, it's time for me to go ahead and check and make sure I got enough clearance. So I put the bulkhead fitting on the end of the super duper Dollar Tree reacher grabber deal. And we've got a good fit. I'm not sure if it's going to come across on camera, especially with the reflection here, but one thing you'll notice is the valve will sit flat here and at the top, but there's a little bit of a gap right there. And what I've always done is I take some channel locks or some hog nose pliers. I bend the bottom and the top in just a little bit to kind of help it sit flatter. I don't put much of a bend in it, but I've never had any leaks since I've done that, so I've always continued to do that on the waste tanks. So I start about right here at the 2 o'clock, and I try to bend that in just a little bit. And I'll work my way around. And then I finish up at about the 10 o'clock. And I do the same thing on the bottom. I'm not going to move the camera to show you, but there's almost no gap left there now. So neither one of the gaskets that I bought worked out. Both of them had rubber that was too soft, and they were really getting contorted whenever I was tightening down the dump valve. So I'm just going to essentially make a gasket. So I applied some RTV silicone right here along this flange and along the threads on that piece, and the inside piece I put it along the flat port where it's going to be flush up against the drum. And remember, I flattened out both these areas, so there's essentially no gap in there. So I think just using the silicone for a gasket and getting it good and tight will be just fine. And it helps to have two people to do this. I was trying to do it earlier when I had no help, and it was almost impossible. So you need one person to hold the inside flange while you screw on your waste tank valve. Okay. We've got our dump valve installed, and I think it's going to be pretty good just using the silicone, not having any leaks. So that's done. Now we'll move on to the lid and mounting the vacuum motors. Alright, now it's time to go ahead and drill our mounting holes for our vacuum motors. Now for this, I'm going to be using 1/4 inch by 20 by 4 inch bolts. For these 5.7s, these are the perfect size. So at this point, you need to decide which direction you're going to want your exhaust horns to be pointing. And it's going to depend on how your setup is designed. For example, this one will have the vac inlet right here coming out, so this will be the front of the machine. And you may want your exhaust pointed to the side or to the back or wherever. But now's the time to decide where you want that pointing, because you're obviously not going to be wanting it pointed right at you. But you need to decide where you want it so that you'll know where to drill your mounting holes. So I found the easiest solution is just have them pointing towards the back. Now remember that the holes that I drilled are a little bit bigger than the hole on the vacuum motor. So you have a little bit of room there to not have it be exactly on top. You want to get as close as you can though. So I just look, I lift the vacuum motor up and look and see about the right spots, and I'll have my horns facing towards the back. So just about right there is where I'm going to mount this one. So I just place my bolts right here. Try to get them level and as upright as possible. And then I'll make a couple marks so I know where the center is. And I'll just continue doing that for each of the 3 tabs on each vacuum motor. So I did go ahead and measure basically from the center of the hole out to each of the marks, just to kind of make sure that I am going to be in the right spot and they weren't too far off. Now I'm going to go ahead and drill the holes. This is one of the key pieces of the system that makes it work together so simply. And all it is an OD floor drain, 2 inch or 3 inch. You can pick these up at Lowe's or Home Depot. They're about $5 a piece. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to mount it right here on the bottom of the lid below the vacuum motor. And this will allow us to have the small vacuum stack underneath the vacuum motors inside the tank. And everything will fit together really, really nicely. But we will need to modify this piece just a little bit. The first thing I'm going to do is try to pull this label off, because we need to access the screws that are holding on the stainless steel plate, which we will not be needing. So just unscrew it, and that piece pops off. You can discard that. This is the piece that we'll be needing. So what I'm going to do with this piece is these holes, I'm going to drill these holes all the way through so they come out right here. And then I'll place it here, mark the holes, drill the lid, and we'll mount this to the lid. I'll be mounting the OD floor drain pieces to the lid using some 832 by 1.5 inch machine screws. I didn't buy these specifically for this purpose. I actually already had these, but this is what I've used before. These are probably left over from there. The only thing I'm going to add is a lock washer and a couple washers to each one, but I'll show you that whenever I start putting the floor drain on. I'm about to drill the holes out. I'm not sure what size drill bit this is because it's worn off, but it's just slightly bigger than the 8/32 screws that I'm going to be using. Just want to try to keep the drill bit straight and have it centered on this flat port right here. Alright, next I'm going to place these centered as best as I can get it over the existing holes that I've drilled for the vacuum motors. And I'm just going to use a lead pen and kind of get the lead sticking out so I can mark the holes where I need to drill. Okay, I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to mount this, and I'm going to run the screws from the top down through into the bottom. That way only a little bit of the head is sticking up, and the gasket on the vacuum motor can easily conform around that. And I'm mounting these with a washer both on the top and on the bottom. And I'm putting the lock washer and then the nut. Okay, so I've got both of these pieces screwed on and tightened up. I'm not going to worry about sealing any of this because this will all be inside of the tank. So even if there was a leak, it doesn't really matter because the vacuum is inside of the tank. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take a small piece of PVC pipe, actually 2 small pieces, just enough to connect these 90s inside of these so they can fit like this. And I don't want it out like this. I want to keep it as close as possible so that I can keep this as high as I can, so that, you know, that minimizes the chance that any water will get into the vacuum ports. Okay, I've got my 2 pieces of PVC cut, not the best cuts in the world, not exactly the straightest cuts either, but I had to go old school with a hacksaw because I couldn't find the PVC cutter. But nonetheless, they'll work just fine. Now, this is the little 90-degree pieces that are going to be inside the baffle that we're going to make. But one thing that I like to do is I'll take some screen material, obviously not metal, but the I don't know what this is, plastic or whatever, and I'll wrap some around the end right here because it'll keep hair and things like that from getting into the vacuum ports. And plus, they're easy to change. All you have to do is cut them off and put some new ones. So I ended up having to buy this whole roll, but fortunately it was $3.50 because it was an open package buy. And I mean, I won't go through this much screen for this purpose in a lifetime. But then again, I think this roll full price is $6.98, so you know, it's not going to break the bank, and you'll have plenty of filter material to use for the future. So I've got my screen cut, and I'm just going to put it like this and kind of wrap it around, and I'm going to secure it with some wire ties. Now these wire ties are really short, so I use several of them. And you just want to be sure it's secured pretty tight because you don't want this to be sucked into your vacuum motors. But honestly, I've never ever had that happen. So, and that'll be a pretty good filter for keeping hair and lint and stuff out of your motors. I actually went and cut the PVC sections down a little bit because they don't go all the way to the top inside here or inside the 90s. So you really only need a fairly small piece to connect them to be able to keep your 90s up as high as possible inside the drum. So you just put your pieces of PVC in here. Now I'm not going to glue these. I've never glued them, and I've never had one come apart. If you want to put some PVC cement on there, that's fine. It's just something that I don't do. And I put on the 90s, which will be facing towards the back. And that pretty much completes the first stack. So now that we have our vacuum stacks installed, one more thing that we need to do to the lid before we put on our vacuum motors is to create a baffle. And we need a baffle to keep the vacuum motors from pulling the water coming in right here into the motors. The baffle is super simple. To make the baffle, I'm just going to use a piece of galvanized metal that I bought from Lowe's, and I believe this is a 24 by 24. Yep, this is a 24 by 24 sheet. I think they ran $11 or $12, and I'm going to bend this into the shape that I want, and then we'll attach it to our lid. To make the baffle, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to measure the width to see just how wide I need to cut the metal. Next, I need to measure the height, and we'll need about 10 inches, and that'll completely shield these vac ports from the incoming water. I'm going to go with a 16-inch wide baffle, which means I really only have to make one cut to cut this section off. And after that, all we have to do is bend this piece. And I'll just be using a pair of 10 snips for this. I think these may be called aviator snips or something like that. To bend the sheet metal into the baffle shape, I'm going to be using a pair of hognose pliers. And this is what I've always used. They work really good because they have a blunt end and a really wide bite. And I don't have access to any type of sheet metal bending equipment. If you don't have some hognose pliers, you could use some channel locks. It may be a little more effort because the jaws don't close all the way, but I think you can do it with channel locks also. The baffle is going to sit like this. It's going to come up about 7 inches. It's going to come back about 8 inches and come back down about 7 inches. And it'll also have a 1-inch lip where we can bolt it onto the lid. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to measure 1 inch all the way down on this side and also the other side, so I'll know where to start my bends. Now that I have the lines drawn for 1 inch in from each side, I'm going to measure out 7 inches to know where the bends need to be for the front and the back. Okay, all my lines are drawn, so now I'm going to go ahead and start bending these. Now, the baffle is going to be coming down like this, so I'm going to bend the edges out so that they can sit flush up against the bottom of the lid. Now, bending sheet metal like this is obviously not the best way to do it, but what I'm going to do is after I get the other end bent, I'll go ahead and I'll clean these up and flatten them out. So I flattened out the ends a little bit more than they were, but remember, this is not pretty. This is not an aesthetic item. This is a functional item. And once it's bolted to the bottom of the lid, it'll be 100% functional. This is something that's in the waste tank that you're not going to see. So if some kind of crinkle cut bends bother you, don't let it, because it's not going to affect the performance. Now for these bends, I'm going to start them on each side right here, and then I'm just going to manually bend it with my hands. So there's our baffle. Not pretty, but definitely functional. I'm going to go ahead and test fit this and make sure that it's right. And it looks pretty good. To attach the baffle, I'll be using some 1/4 inch by 20 3/4 inch machine screws, which I'll also be adding a washer and a lock washer to. Actually, I'll be adding 2 washers. For the side of the lid that's going to have the vac inlet, I'll put a few extra screws. I'll probably put about 5 screws across here. And on the back side, I'll either put 2 or 3. I just want to be sure that there's not going to be any vacuum coming through this area right here. I went ahead and I tightened down all the nuts, so now the baffle is installed. Next, I'm going to go ahead and install the vacuum port. First, I need to remove this 2-inch bung fitting. A lot of times these are really tight, so you might have to bang on it with something to get it loose. I've already loosened this one up, so I'm going to go ahead and unscrew it. Here are the parts that I'm going to need to make the vacuum port. First, I'm going to need a 2-inch screw-in hose barb. I purchased this at Grainger, but Tractor Supply also has these, and of course you can order them online. It's a 2-inch coupling right here, and it has screw-in. It has threads to screw into a 2-inch port, which will go right here. This is just a piece of PVC to connect them. Now this piece of PVC is longer than I need, but I cut it earlier, and I'm just going to go ahead and use it. It'll just make the vacuum port a little taller than it needs to be. And this is also another coupler with female threads. Now this is a 90-degree, and it's reduced right here. I don't know what you call it, but you can see it's just a little bit smaller in that area. So here's how I'm going to put it together. First, I'm going to wrap some Teflon tape around the screw-in fitting that's going to go in our drum. And I'll go ahead and screw that in. Next, I'll put in the short piece of PVC. Again, it's a little bit taller than it needs to be, but it'll work just fine for the video. And of course, you can always glue these together if you need. I'm not going to do it right here. Next, I'll take our 90 with the slightly reduced end, slide it over this. Next, I'll put some Teflon tape over the threads of the screw-in barb. Go ahead and screw that in here. And I'll sit this on top of the piece of PVC. I'm going to go ahead and temporarily take the vacuum port off while I install the vacuum motors. To install the vac motors, I'm going to be using the 1/4 inch bolt with a washer, and it'll go through the vac motor tab, through the lid, and then I'll put another regular washer there on the bottom, a lock washer, and a nut. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to mount the gaskets on the vac motors. You want to mount the gaskets onto the vac motor because it's more likely that you'll be changing out the vac motor than the lid on the tank. And that way the gasket's not stuck to the tank, it's just stuck to the vacuum motor. So remember, these are segmented, so you want to kind of keep it together if you can. Sometimes they come apart really easily. And if you never did this before, I mean, it's pretty self-explanatory. You just line up the hole on the gasket with the hole on the motor, and then you be sure that it's stuck on there pretty good. The easiest way to mount the vac motors to the lid is to just lay them on a flat surface. Here I'm using the bottom of the drum, and you can lay the lid on top of it. I have all of my bolts in my vac motors, and I've got them pretty well straight. So now I'm going to go ahead and tighten them up. Now, one thing I want to strongly caution you about is do not, under any circumstances, over tighten these vacuum motors. The first time I ever built one of these machines, I over tightened the vacuum motors, and it's very easy to crush the fan case. So whatever you do, do not over tighten it. You're going to think, well, there's still some play in that nut, and I want to go a little tighter. But as long as it's on there securely, that's when you want to stop. That rubber gasket is going to keep it really sealed well. So don't over tighten these motors, or you can potentially ruin them. After you tighten the first nut a little bit, move to the second nut, tighten it a little bit, and then move to the third. And repeat that process several times. And between each time, look underneath at the gasket between the vacuum motor and the lid, because you don't want to crush that gasket very much. I think I've got the first vacuum motor tightened down about where it needs to be. The lock washers are still have a little bit of a gap in them, but one thing that you can do to make sure that you didn't tighten it down too much is you can put your finger in here, and be careful because they're short metal, but you can spin the fan, and if the fan spins freely, you know they're probably not tightened down too much. When I flip this over and have it the proper way sitting on the drum, you can feel if there's any play in the vac motor, and if there's not, you're probably going to be good. So I'm going to go ahead and get the other one tightened down, and we'll check for the fitment. Okay, I flipped the lid back over, and the vacuum motors appear to be just fine. They're not loose, they're not over tightened, both of them spin freely. Now, the holes that I've drilled in the lid for these bolts to come through, yes, they're going to have a little gap around there, because on the bottom there's a washer and a nut there. If you think there's going to be some air escaping through those holes, you can certainly put some silicone around there, or you could actually put another washer and a nut on the top side. I never found it necessary, but again, that's totally up to you. And also, when you mount your vacuum motors to the lid, be sure that you have your horns faced in the right direction that you're going to want them to be in. So the next thing that I need to do is wire up the vacuum motors to some cords. Now, I am not going to put switches on this machine. The whole point of this machine is for it to be as simple as possible. And if you decide to build one of these, you can certainly add switches. I use just regular household switches on mine. You can use toggle switches, or you can just have the motors wired directly to extension cords, whether you're going to use a generator, plug into a home, or however you're going to do it. But to keep it simple, I'm not going to put switches on here. And as a matter of fact, the first two of these that I made didn't even have switches. I didn't add switches till later on. The cords that I'm going to be using are just two standard extension cords. I'm not sure of the length because I've already had these. They're either 15 or 20 feet long. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to cut the ends off right here, and I'm going to wire those to the vacuum motors. I went ahead and stripped the orange insulation off of the extension cords, and I stripped the ends of the hot and the neutral wires on both of them. Now, I did not strip the ground wires, and here's why. The older models of the Lamb vac motors had 3 wires. They had both the black and the white wire and the green ground wire. The newer models do not have a green ground wire. I had read online that it wasn't necessary, and I don't know where the source of that information was, but I did read that somewhere online that it wasn't necessary to ground the motors. I'm using 14 gauge extension cords. Now, if I was buying extension cords, I would go with 12 gauge, but I'm using extension cords I already had, and to be honest, I believe on my machine that I've been using for years, they're actually 14 gauge. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to cap off that green ground wire that I'm not going to be using. And then next, I'll attach the neutral to the neutral. And the hot to the hot. Now I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to use some electrical tape and wrap up these connections. Now, if you don't want to just use electrical tape, you can actually use some wire loom here. Now I'll go ahead and I'll do the other side. Okay, now I'm going to put the eye bolts in each side for my tie downs. And for that I'll put a washer on the top, and a washer and a lock washer and a nut on the bottom. Alright, I've got both eye bolts installed. Now the last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take my extension cords and I'm going to leave a little bit of slack right here so they don't get pulled, and I can use one of these eye bolts to tighten these down with a wire tie to help hold them into place. I think I'm actually going to use 2 wire ties since these aren't that big. And then I'm going to put one more right here around this motor bolt. And one more right here. Okay, I added a couple more wire ties in various spots just to hold the wires down, and be sure if you pull an extension cord that you won't rip it off the wires from the vacuum motor. So I'll put the vacuum port on, and this project is done. The primary focus of this video was to show the vacuum system, because I believe that's what most people struggle with. And as you can see, I built it with no special tools. Nothing, you don't really need anything other than hand tools. And it was really fairly easy to build. Now, as far as the pump, there's not a lot that I can show because there's so many variables when it comes to a pump. You have your small demand pumps like SureFlow and Aquatech, or you can go with something like the PumpTech pumps, or even the pump that I use is a pressure washer type pump, but it requires an additional motor to run it, similar to the PumpTech 356 that I used to use. It's a powerful pump, but you have to have a power source for it, and you're not going to be able to get that on just 2 cords. You're going to have to run a 3rd cord. Now, for many years I just used tap pressure, where I would hook to the sink faucet, run the hot water, and what I gave up in pressure I made up for with flow, and it actually worked really good. The limitations were tile and grout. You have to have higher pressure for that, but there's a lot of options for you to pick from for the pump. So you have to decide which type of pump you're going to go with. If you go with one of the smaller PumpTech type pumps, you can get away with just using 2 cords. But when you go with something bigger like the one I have, or one of the bigger PumpTechs, where you're going to need a separate electric motor to run it, you're going to have to go to 3 cords. Now, you may have a big generator, and that won't be an issue. I use a generator simply for convenience. I don't like having to find 3 outlets. Now, if you don't have a problem finding 3 outlets, well, that'll work for you. But for a lot of people, they don't want to fool with more than a couple cords, and you're going to have to keep a smaller pump. PumpTech makes some really decent pumps around 300, 400, 500 psi that don't require a lot of power, so you can run that whole system on just 2 cords. So there's a lot of options out there. Now I'm going to do a demonstration using tap pressure. I'm just going to hook up to the water hose outside. I'm going to use the supply hose off my machine, which I can connect directly to the wand. And my supply hose, I have it set up so that, number one, I can hook to the water at customers' homes. But second, if my pump ever goes out, that hose doubles as a backup system for me to hook up just to the tap to finish the job, so that I don't have to leave the job incomplete. First, I'm going to go ahead and plug in these vacuum motors and make sure everything is running like it's supposed to. Alright, everything seems to be working fine. The vacuums have plenty of power. And again, I know I mentioned this earlier in the video, but I want to say it again. Don't get hung up on the numbers. No matter which vacuum you use, there's going to be the CFM and the lift numbers. And it seems that online, especially, people get hung up on these numbers when in the real world there are so many variables to consider. So use something that works in real world. Those 6.6 motors, they may be the best thing since sliced bread, but I can tell you without a doubt the 116, 765 13s have performed flawlessly. And when I can get a 175 foot hose run out of these vacuum motors, that should tell you something. Do I recommend routine 175 foot hose runs? No, but my average job requires 125 feet of hose. But a typical residential job or a light commercial job where you don't need 200 plus feet of hose, this is a very economical system that's going to work really, really well. So you can use whatever vacuum motors you want. Hey, maybe you could put some 6.6s on here. They would crush the whole drum. But that brings me to another point. One thing that some of you may ask is whether you need to reinforce the inside of the drum. I don't find it necessary. If I was using a positive displacement blower, yes, it would crush the drum. I've never had an issue with the electric vacuum motors causing any type of cavitation or anything. Now, I don't know if you can see it on video, but when you turn the system on, the lid does, it depresses in there pretty well. It also seals down this right here, which I was mentioning earlier, why I don't use the bolt ring on it. I was actually worried about the metal fatiguing, getting sucked in and out on the lid years ago, and it just turned out it was not an issue. But I don't feel that reinforcing the inside of the drum is really necessary for the electric vacs. The next thing I want to talk about is a heating source for your water. Now, if you're going to go with something simple like using tap pressure, of course you can use the hot water from wherever you're cleaning. And really your only other two options, or I should say practical options with a homemade system, is to go with electric heat or propane. I went the electric heat route one time, and electric heat is really hard for the electric to keep up with the amount of water when you're flowing a decent amount of water through your wine. Not to mention, that's going to be a third or maybe even fourth cord. So for me, propane was the obvious and easy choice. That's what I use. You can see it in some of the other videos that I posted. They're really not even that expensive when you consider the longevity that you're going to get out of them. As a matter of fact, I've had my propane heater since either 2011 or 2012. And the only thing that I've done to it is one time I needed to replace the thermocouple, and one time I took the coil out and just got any buildup out of the inside. But other than that, it's been maintenance free. So I would recommend propane, but then again, I know that's not going to fit into everyone's budget right in the beginning. So like when I started, I was using tap pressure, hot water from wherever I was cleaning at, and an exact system like this one. I'm going to go ahead and show you the vacuum system at work. To do this, I'm going to be using the water supply hose that I normally use on my system is air hose because it's much easier to manage than traditional water hose. So what I did was I hooked it up to the water hose, and the other end is connected to my wine. Now the way I have my system set up is on the end of my supply hose I have a female quick connect that goes into a male quick connect on the pump. This way, if my pump ever goes down during a job, I can simply bypass the pump and hook directly to the water source and finish the job. Now, of course, this wasn't a particularly dirty rug, but I just wanted to do a little demonstration on it. It's really the only thing that I had to clean, just so you can see the system at work. And that I'm running, what is this? Running about 75 feet of hose off of the wand. I left the exhaust horns open on my machine. I actually used some wire flex hose that I clamped to them and just kind of ran them down. But it's really up to you whether you want to do that or not. But it does get hot, so just don't have it blowing on anything that really can't take a lot of heat. I hope some of you guys that are on the fence about building their own electric truck mount, or maybe you haven't even thought of it yet, I hope you found this helpful. I spent a lot of time doing this video so that those of you who may be considering it would have at least a guide to know how to build the vacuum system, so you don't have to put out all that money. Because look, there's nothing nicer than buying yourself a nice new $20,000 truck mount until you get those truck mount payments. And look, if you're making tons of money in the carpet cleaning business, you know, maybe those payments are no big deal. But when you can start up for hundreds of dollars rather than multiple thousands of dollars, there's something to be said for that. And this machine is not going to be for everybody. I realize that. If I had started with the big truck mount payments when I first started, you know, I would have been out of business super quick. So if you don't have tons of money, this may be a good option for you. And don't let anybody tell you that either a homemade system or an electric system can't do the job. The truth of the matter is, I could go out right now and buy a traditional gas truck mount with cash and not have any payments. And I say that not to brag, but the point is I'm still choosing to use the system basically exactly like this, just with a different tank. And I choose to do that for the simplicity of everything. It's nice to be able to switch out a vacuum motor and it only costs you $125 or so, rather than having your machine sit at one of the distributors trying to figure out what's wrong with it, paying for labor, paying for overpriced parts, which we all know in the carpet cleaning industry, everything seems to be overpriced. Now, I know I had one comment on one of the videos saying they didn't consider this to be an electric truck mount because I had to have a generator to power it. And nothing could be further from the truth. I don't have to have a generator. As I said earlier, it's simply a convenience. So you don't have to have a generator for this system. And if you're using one of the Pump Tech pumps or something like that, or even going with tap pressure, you're still only using 2 cords. It's not that big of a deal to plug that in to a customer's house. So anyway, I'm going to wrap this up. I hope you found it helpful. If you would, please like this video, consider subscribing to my channel, and as always, I'll see you in the next video.